Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the first section of the Statewide Assessment Regional Workshop. We ran these in October of 2019. I'm Jeremy Henniger, I'm the Director of Statewide Assessment. In this first section, we're going to be covering the Nebraska Student-Centered Assessment System, or NSCAS, and it's an update on innovation and evolution. So we're looking at where we're going from here with the NSCAS system. How do we continue to improve and expand the system? And really for us, it's really this question here is how do we utilize the current components of NSCAS to strengthen integration and cohesion, right? So how do we take what we currently have and improve upon it? And so if we look at this, again, a unified model that really helps to facilitate equity of opportunity and outcomes for students. Additionally, this is the why of what we're doing. So we want to provide improved instructional relevant data to educators. We want to promote educator inquiry about next steps. So how do we move each student forward? How do we track student growth across time and across districts? It's an important question for us, and one that we're looking at. All of these we're looking at as we're thinking about the future. Can we reduce test time and continue to maximize instructional time and can still be compliant with state and federal law? Continues to build cohesive, balanced assessment system, right? For students and educators. So for a while now, we've been focusing on a balanced education or a balanced assessment system, and we've been trying to build pieces and parts that go towards that goal. So just kind of set up some guardrails here for us, some guidance. We're talking about NSCAS General, ELA, and Math for grades 3 through 8 specifically. So we're really talking about that subsection of the NSCAS system. And just to kind of set up a timeline for you early on, just so you know, the changes that I'm going to be talking about today really aren't going to take place until 2021, 2022. So last year with 18-19 was kind of business as usual. The next 2 years, we're going to be building the system that I'm going to describe today, and then we're going to transform that system, our current system, in 21, 22. So that kind of gives you some context for where we're going and how long it's going to take us to get there. Additionally, make sure we're talking to make sure we have those guardrails set up. We're not talking about science. So we've already set up a timeline for science. We're doing spring field tests this year in the spring of 2020. And we're working towards an operational test in the spring of 2021. That is our current timeline. That's where we're going. The changes that we're talking about, the evolution that we're talking about for ELA and Math is not going to happen in science, at least not right away. We're going to get this test, this NSCAS science test off the ground and get it operational in 2021 for grades 5 and 8. And then we'll continue to look at the system and how do we improve it from there. So to start out with, I think it's important when we're talking about the future to understand where we've been. We're not going to go back as far as the STARS era when we're setting up this historical context, but we are going to start in 2007 when the unicameral passed the law that created statewide assessments in the state of Nebraska. What a lot of people don't realize about that law, or maybe it's been lost to time now, is that the purposes of the statewide assessment were actually laid out in the law itself. There are 4 different purposes that are laid out. I'm not going to read each of those to you. When we did this live, we had educators look through these 4 different purposes and talk about what they noticed or didn't notice that was included in these 4 purposes. The participants shared information about how they only saw students one time in these purposes, right? Educators aren't mentioned at all. Growth is not mentioned at all. Improvement is not mentioned at all. It's really about a comparison of schools. And it's really about what I would call accountability purposes. So really the statewide assessments, when they were put into place originally with the NISA test, it was all about accountability. And really NISA was that. This is probably lost a little bit to time as well, is that NISA actually stood for Nebraska State Accountability. It didn't actually stand for Nebraska State Assessment. And so that accountability piece was important in the purpose of that. And the reason I mentioned that is because design and purpose go hand in hand when we talk about assessments, right? So if these are the purposes, the assessments were designed for these purposes, and specifically for these purposes. And I should also mention that there's nothing wrong with these purposes, right? As a summative measure, these types of accountability measures are just fine. We should probably be accountable to the public, since we use public dollars for education, and so we should have some accountability purposes. Now, we can always argue about how much accountability and what form it should take. In general, I think in Nebraska, we've done a pretty good job. We've tried to focus on improvement with our accountability system and not punitive measures. We worked really hard to try to not make it a ranking in an A through F type of system like you see in some other states. So there's some pretty good things about what we do, but that's not to say that there's not room to improve that as well. But as far as the purposes go, like I said, for the assessment, it was designed to meet those purposes. Now, this is all fine and good, but from the very beginning of this, there seemed to be a tension, right? Because educators wanted something different from the NISA test, the NSCAS test now. They wanted educational priorities to be what came from that. They wanted results that could inform instruction, inform curriculum, but really that's not what the purpose of the test were, so they weren't designed that way. Teachers got limited information back from the NISA test and the NSCAS test, and so there's this tension, right, between what policymakers want and what educators want. And this is just a partial list of what some educators have shared with us about what they wanted from a statewide assessment, right? These are the types of things that you would hear from educators if they were writing out the purposes for statewide assessment. And so they really are at tension with what the policymakers had put in law. And so I'll also mention that it's important that we fulfill the purposes and the law. If we don't fulfill those purposes, then we're not following the law. And that's oftentimes problematic for many different reasons. But we also needed to fulfill the federal reasons that we needed to do this as well, and that's about reporting, showing gaps, and those types of things if they exist. So like I said, all of these things are kind of create a tension between what policymakers and educators wanted. And then we got to a time where we created the AQuest accountability system. Part of that AQuest system was really about saying, here are the tenets, here are 6 big chunks, pieces of education that we want to focus on and think about improving. The assessment tenet is one of those. You'll see as you read through there that it doesn't mention balanced assessment specifically, but it does talk about using multiple measures and use those multiple sources of information to inform instructional processes. And making sure that they're aligned to those college and career ready standards, right? So this was the first piece. A second piece that happened about the same time is the State Board of Education adopted a position statement on assessment of student learning. And here you'll see the language is much different from the purposes that are outlined in the law. Balanced assessment is mentioned multiple times, using multiple assessments is used multiple times, but it really then comes down to improving student achievement by informing instruction. It talks about growth, measuring growth and improvement and guiding instruction. And so the language is much more what you would typically see from educators. And so what I'd also say is about the same time, the ESSA law happened, right, which gave us federally gave us a little bit more room And so if you look at the work of the board, the work of the commissioner's office, the language that is put in here about balanced assessment, the freedom of that ESSA law really allowed the statewide assessment office and NDE to create a very different RFP, or request for proposal, the last time around. And so that was a very different RFP than you would typically see for a summative assessment system. And so we really put in there that we were looking for a vendor partner that could support a balanced approach to assessment, that would do more for us and help us more than just creating a platform for a summative assessment, that would help us with other types of assessment, help us with professional learning. You can see some of the types of things that we included in that RFP proposal back in 2017. Also, then NWA bid on that contract and ultimately won that RFP bid proposal process. And because we wrote a very different RFP, NWA responded with a very different RFP proposal. And if you look at the language here, it much more mirrors what educators would want, as opposed to what those policy makers wanted. That doesn't mean we aren't still fulfilling the purposes outlined by those policymakers, but once again, it's much more friendly to the types of things that educators wanted. So from the very beginning of the awarding of that contract, I would say there was a lot of promise, a lot of hope for educators in the state of Nebraska that things were changing as far as the statewide assessment system. Unfortunately, there was also some misunderstanding. So one of those misunderstandings is that people thought that we were just going to use map growth as a summative assessment. NWA knew we weren't going to do that. NDE knew we weren't going to do that, because map growth does not actually, by itself, does not meet the federal requirements for a state summative test. It really doesn't give us the types of grade level information that we have to use to determine proficiency. And so some people misunderstood that. It caused some confusion. But there was still a lot of promise, I would argue, at the time, because Nebraska had a high quality, technically sound statewide assessment. We had an item bank that was written by Nebraska educators. We had new item types that we were working towards and adding at the time. And we were really, at this point, we were transitioning to the college and career ready aligned assessments. At the same time, 86% of the Nebraska districts were already using map growth in some form, and additional districts were already moving towards adding map growth in their own districts at the time of the awarding of the contract. Additionally, and I think this is really important, that there was approximately 50 educators across Nebraska that were a part of NWA's Certified Facilitator Program. That Certified Facilitator Program was all about professional learning for map growth specifically, but there was a system already in place for professional learning around assessments that we could take advantage of, and that we have. I think we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. So there's all kinds of promise at this point in time. And what we created, the current components of NSCAS, if you look at this, we tried to create supports of a balanced assessment system, right? So one thing that I'll mention about balanced assessment systems is that the Department of Education cannot create a balanced assessment system. Districts have to do that. But what we can do at the department is try to create supports that districts can use in the creation of a balanced assessment system. So if we look at the components of NSCAS and what we've done, obviously here we have the summative test that is the only part of this that is required in the spring of each year for the grades that we all know and for the subjects that we all know. We also made available to all districts the interim NSCAS, which is map growth, NWA's map growth product. And you can use that up to 4 times a year and determine the grades for grades 3 through 8, that it was at no additional cost to the districts because the state was picking up that cost in our contract. So that was available, but it was optional for districts. And then formative supports, we have been offering TestWiz which is a combination of the old Check for Learning system and the Navigate item bank. And this is a formative support that's out there that teachers can use, that districts can use. Districts choose how they use that particular support in their district, whether it's highly organized or teachers take a lot of that effort on their own. But that's a formative support, a classroom support that's available there. And then wrapped around all of this is professional learning. Like I said, we talked about the certified facilitators. When the Nebraska took over that contract or was awarded that contract, we brought the certified facilitators in under the contract. We've added to it. We now have 72 certified facilitators. In addition to the MAP growth, professional learning, there's NSCAS professional learning, there's assessment literacy professional learning, and we continue to add more to that, the offerings that certified facilitators can do around professional learnings to help support districts. Every ESU in the state has a certified facilitator now. Most of our large districts have certified facilitators that can help in that professional learning around assessment and around the NSCAS system as a whole. So those are the current components. If we look at the formative, the interim, and the summative, each of those pieces are good in and of themselves, right? So the summative piece meets the technical quality that we need. Interim really serves the purpose of informed instruction. That formative test whiz is there for districts to use how they see fit. But what I would say about each one of these is that they really stay in their own lanes. They're each kind of individual and they don't talk to each other really well. And we've tried to improve that and try to improve that integration over time. The interim piece, for instance, is now predictive of summative. So when a student takes the interim test any time of year, you can get a prediction on how they're likely to do on their next summative test. But other than that, and the alignment of the whole piece of each of those assessments being aligned to standards, the pieces of the program don't really talk to each other. They each really stay in their lane. So what we're talking about improving is that integration and the cohesion of the whole. So now if we look at the current landscape, if we look at NSCAS, general, ELA, and math, like I said, which is what we're focused on here today, we have those aligned to the college and career ready standards for 3 or 2 years, depending on the subject. We've included additional types of technology enhanced items. It's computer adaptive. Our summative ELA and math tests are adaptive only at grade level, so the student gets easier questions or harder questions based on how they perform, but they stay at grade level. We do have a paper accommodated form. One thing that I'll mention about that is less than 200 students are using that paper accommodated form, which I think is great. That means most of our students are getting that adaptive test because the paper form isn't adaptive. Currently, it's an untimed single session, but it is divided and oftentimes divided into multiple sessions. And for the first time this coming year in 2019-20, we're going to get near immediate results, right? So what do I mean by near immediate results? In 2020, when a student takes ELA or math, you are going to get a scale score and proficiency level, achievement level within 48 hours. That is our intention, is to have that within 48 hours. You get those on near immediate results. And one thing that I'll mention about that is those are preliminary results. You'll get final results later on once the psychometricians go through all the processes to verify everything. But those, we don't anticipate changes at all. If they are, they'll be minor. But you'll get those preliminary results almost immediately in 2020. So if we look at a traditional summative model, we're kind of putting this together here for you so you can see what we're doing now versus where we think we're going here. So a traditional summative model, especially in Nebraska where there isn't a set curriculum, districts, it doesn't matter which district it is, you're teaching, and then you have a summative test and a total score, proficiency level determined in the spring, right? And so it doesn't matter what order you teach it in, as long as you're teaching grade level content. Different districts can teach in different orders, and then that's fine, and the system supports that. So for the features of this, it fulfills the purposes laid out in law, right? So it measures attainment and retention, so we can see how they do at the end of the year. Domain sampling supports year-to-year growth inference, so we can look at last year's versus this year, especially with the vertical scale now. The meaning of the score is relatively clear, I would say. We know what proficiency means, and we have a descriptors of those proficiencies, right? Those achievement level descriptors are available for us, so we can interpret what those scores mean. And it scales up, like I said, under different pacing guides. So it doesn't matter what order any district teaches in with the local control that we have. And so it works with those different pacing guides, different curriculum orders that happen. Some of the challenges, though, is many people might think this is a burdensome test event. It takes a lot of time. And has a lot of pieces as far as security goes and all of those types of things. Feedback comes too late. I would say that this is true even if it comes back almost immediately, because you're not getting feedback from the summative system until the very end of the year. So even if it comes back with near immediate results, it doesn't inform, and it can't inform instruction during the course of the year. Some might argue that there's too much cumulative testing because you take the stuff at the beginning of the year and you don't test it till the end of the year. And it's very far away from some of the content that's taught at different points in the year. One thing with growth is that summer loss is mixed in with year-to-year growth, so you don't know exactly how much was lost during the summer months, and it excludes within-year growth, right? So you don't get a measure at the beginning of the year and the end of the year to see how much growth actually occurred within the year. So if we look at NSCAS interim or map growth for 3 through 8, just a couple of pieces about this and make sure we understand this part. So it's, like I said before, it's optional to districts. They choose what grade level and how often they're going to test with the map growth. It's computer adaptive, and it goes outside of grade level. So if you have a struggling student, it may go below their current grade level. For students that are highly skilled, they might go outside above their grade level. Getting near immediate results, once again, that are more informative for teachers, schools, and districts. I would also argue for students as well. District is currently a district responsibility for this. So if we look at this model here, once again, we're teaching, but we give interim tests near the beginning of the year to kind of find out where students are. We continue to teach. Once again, it doesn't matter what order we're teaching the content, as long as we're teaching grade level content. Then we get additional information with a interim test in the winter. We continue to teach, and we continue to get another interim score at the end of the year. So some of the features of this, each administration is independently adaptive. There's timely feedback during the year to inform instructional decisions. It supports off-grade and on-grade growth. So if a student is below or above grade level, we can still see the growth within year and across year growth. So we can look from year to year, from winter to winter, from fall to fall, from spring to spring. But we also can look within year, right? So for fall to spring, how much growth occurred. There's a common vertical scale, the RIT score. People know that fairly well, and you can track growth over time and historically look at how students are growing. It's norm reference, so we can compare how our students are doing with national norms and state norms to see how our students are doing compared to other students across the country, across the state. And it measures retention, right? If the student knew something in the fall, we can look at it again. Do they still know it in the winter, still know it in the spring? So it also measures retention as well. So let's look at the landscape of map testing in Nebraska currently. So this is information from 1718 and 1819, breaks it down into fall, winter, and spring at the top for students testing on map growth. For context, there's about 144,000 students in grades 3 through 8. And so this is only 3 through 8 information here. You can see last year in the fall, about 138,000 out of that 144,000 students tested using map growth. In the winter, that number dropped to about 117,000 out of the 144,000. And then again in spring, it dropped again to 103,000 out of the 144,000. We know that there are more districts that don't test in the spring because they also have to do NSCAS testing. So we can assume that that's one of the reasons why the number is lower in spring. If we look at district numbers, we can see there's 244 districts in the state of Nebraska. Fall last year, if we look at reading and math, we see that 243 districts out of the 244 districts tested. We know that all 244 districts used map growth at some point last year. You can see the numbers decrease in winter and then are about the same in spring for the number of districts that are testing during those times. So this gives us a general idea of how much map growth testing is being done in the state. We know that the majority of students in grades 3 through 8 are testing in the fall, and those numbers decline. We know that the number of districts testing also declines over the course of the year. So this gives us a little bit of context as we move forward. And so now we get to the main part of the presentation, evolving NSCAS. So what do we mean by evolving NSCAS? What is what is the direction we're going, and what are we going to, how are we going to get there? So for that context, again, it's called the NSCAS Adaptive Through-Year Model. And these are the goals that we're hoping to accomplish, what we hope to accomplish by moving to this adaptive through-year model. Like we talked about before, the first three of these anyway have to do with instruction, provide better information throughout the year, examines learning and context there closer to the time of instruction, and also reinforces assessment as an instructional tool. Oftentimes, assessment can receive a bad name, but we know that assessment is a vital tool in the triumvirate of curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And when assessment is used well and purposefully, and it remains a powerful tool for improvement. And so we want to reinforce that idea that assessment is an instructional tool and try to get back to that as much as possible. Also here, we're going to try to provide multiple opportunities for students to showcase what they know with the college and career ready standards. We're hoping to decrease overall testing time. We'll explain how we do that here in a minute. And overall, we're going to utilize the strengths of NSCAS General, Summative, and Map Growth, right? So we're going to use what's the best of both of those in this NSCAS Adaptive Through-Year Model. And what we're hoping to do is get back to some of these types of ideas, what educators want from a summative assessment or an assessment system, as opposed to just what was put out there by the policymakers. We're still going to do that. We're still going to make sure that we give those summative assessment pieces and get those achievement levels and everything, but we're hoping to get more to what educators are looking for. So if we look at this in its simplest version, the NSCAS Adaptive Through-Year Model is really just a combination of NSCAS Summative and NSCAS Interim or Map Growth in a hybrid model. And I use the word hybrid in a very positive way here. Hybrid to me means the best of both, right? So we're going to keep the best of NSCAS Summative and we're going to keep the best of Map Growth moving forward. So breaking this down, we're going to break it down a couple of different ways and look at it a couple of different ways here. It's going to, the adaptive through-year model is going to allow us to multiple measures from one model. It's going to still give us that summative proficiency score once a year for accountability purposes to determine achievement level and proficiency. We're going to get grade level performance data up to 3 times a year in time for districts to adjust instruction. We're going to be able to look at growth year to year still and aggregate summative performance like we have been, but we're also going to be able to look at growth in year, right? So from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, we're going to get better and more robust growth information, regardless of what achievement level a student is at. So here's another model. If we're going to break this apart a little bit, in this model, we're looking at fourth grade, a fourth grade student taking the adaptive through-year model. You'll see there's the fall, winter, and spring. First of all, and this is very important, we're going to keep what educators like about map growth. From our very earliest conversations, I was very clear, we've been very clear working with NWA that we need to keep what educators like about map growth. And that is our intention, to keep the very best parts about that, the RIT score, the growth, the information to inform instruction, all of those pieces, we're going to keep the very best of that as we move forward. We're going to have up to 3 administrations with a common blueprint. So a common blueprint is going to sit behind each of these administrations for summative purposes. Please notice that the fall and winter are optional but encouraged. They are optional. If districts choose not to give those, that is perfectly fine. But they're going to miss out on the rich data that's going to come from those opportunities. And students are going to have less opportunities to show what they know. The spring is still going to be required. All students are going to still have to take that test. You'll notice that in the fall, a student is going to be able to go up or down out of grade level, just like they always have, and map growth. And so in the fall, they could go below grade level or above grade level, depending on their ability. With the winter administration, it's the same. They'll be able to go up and down. And the spring, they will may be able to go above grade level or below grade level, depending on what they did the rest of the year. And we'll kind of get to what that looks like here in a minute. So it's also important to know that each administration is going to be more efficient than they have been in the past, because we're going to pick up where they left off, right? So each of these is going to be about as long as a map administration, and they're going to pick up where they left off. So when a student comes in and starts testing in fourth grade, if they use the system when they were in third grade, we're going to be able to pick up that end of the year and use that information to know where to start them, or to better know where to start them, and that will make the test more efficient. Then in the winter, we'll once again we'll pull that prior information from fall into the winter, and so we'll better know where the student is and be able to be more efficient about testing that student. And again, in the spring, we're going to use that prior information again to determine where to start the student out as we administer that exam. I should also mention about this prior information that it does not matter what district a student tests in. If they have this information, we'll use the information from wherever they are in the state of Nebraska. So if a student was in District A in the fall and moves to District B, we can still use that prior information from the previous district. If they move again, we can still use that prior information across districts. So this new model really helps with some of the issues around mobility, and really allows us to continue to monitor where students are, no matter where they test, no matter what district that they happen to be in. The proficiency is going to be measured by state-aligned ELA and math content that's approved by Nebraska educators. So some of the neat things about this, so each of these right now is adaptive, right? It's adaptive in each of these sessions. Well, in this new system, basically, it's adaptive across time. So it's not only adaptive within administrations, but it's also adaptive throughout the year. We'll be able to use that prior information. That adaptive nature will help find where students are and give the student items that meet their ability and challenge them, but meet them where they are. So each of these is important because it's adaptive across the years, like I said. So the whole thing is an adaptive through-year model. Also, it is highly configurable, and the reason I mention that is because there's lots of decisions left to be made. We're going to continue to bring in educators to help inform us as we go along this. I didn't mention this at the beginning of the presentation, but all along this road, we've given many presentations. We've gotten a lot of feedback from people before we went public with this information. Educators from districts, educators from ESUs, educators from NDE. We continue to make decisions in a way that includes lots of stakeholders to make decisions as we move forward. And as we make those continuing decisions, we're going to make sure that educators from across the state continue to be involved. Okay, so if we break this back down to the model we were using earlier, so if we look at the adaptive through-year model, once again, we have content being taught throughout the year. Once again, one of the nice things about this model is it, again, doesn't require a common curriculum. We need to teach at the at grade level standards, but it doesn't matter what order a district teaches in. It will adapt to where the students are and what they know. So once again, we're going to be teaching. We're going to give an interim test. We get interim results. That can inform instruction as we move forward. We test again and we get updated interim results. We continue to teach and hopefully and be informed by those updated interim results. And then we test again and we get updated interim results again. And then we're going to use all the information to determine proficiency. So if a student only tested in the spring, we would only have that one test to base the results on. And that's fine because we're going to make sure they have the blueprint or the TOS, they've met those requirements to determine proficiency. But if a student had multiple opportunities, right, if they took the test in fall, the test in winter, and the test in spring, we're going to be able to use all of that information to determine proficiency. So if a student wasn't able to show us a skill in the fall, maybe we give them a second chance in the winter and a third chance again to show us what they know in the spring. And so students are able to have multiple opportunities to show us what they know and what skills they have. So first of all, we get timely feedback. At the end of each one of these, we're going to get map-like information back at the end of each one of these assessments. And so we're going to continue to get information that informs instruction, gives us information to determine what our students know, what is the next thing they need to know as they continue to move forward. It should reduce the total overall testing time. Like I said, there's about 107 students out of 107,000 students out of 144,000 students in the spring that were taking both the MAP growth and the NSCAS. Well, now they only have to take one test. They only have to take this adaptive through-year model. And so they only have to do that one time. And so they only have to take one test at that time, and they get information on both of those pieces. So domain sampling preserves the construct. We continue to test pieces of everything as we move throughout the year. It allows for a multiplicity of pacing guides. Like I said before, it doesn't matter what order you teach fourth grade content and math. Whatever scope and sequence you use should be supported by this model. Additionally, it supports off-grade and on-grade growth, so we can look at year-to-year growth, and we can look at within year, so fall to spring growth. It is both norm referenced and criterion reference in us determining proficiency, but also we'll get norm reference information where we'll be able to compare how our students did with students from across the nation. So we'll still get that normed reference piece of information that's important. This one's kind of funny because it says avoids complex psychometric models. I don't know about you, but to me, almost all psychometric models are complex. And this particular model is less complex than others. For instance, we're not weighting particular administrations against one another. And so in general, it is relatively simple in comparison to other models that we might use. Measures retention, so we're going to be able to see if a student knows something and then check back with them later on, so it can measure retention. And we believe it's likely to pass peer review. Peer review is the federal level that we need to reach to show that we have technically sound and high quality tests. And so we believe that this model, this adaptive through-year model, is likely to pass that peer review. Like I said before, we're going to retain the best of map growth. So right now it's going to take about the same time as the current content levels. So we're going to measure, like we said, student performance and growth irrespective of grade level within and across years. So if a student is struggling, if a student is ahead of schedule, we're going to be able to still look at growth regardless of where that student is. We're still going to produce the RIT information. So the RIT score and fall, winter, and spring, that information is going to still be given to districts and to schools and to students, to teachers, and you're going to be able to look at that information historically. So you're going to be able to say, what were their RIT scores before we moved into this, and continue to track that information into this new model. You're going to still have access to NWEA's norms, so growth can be considered in context to similar students nationally. So that's really important to be able to compare how we're doing across the country. It's adaptive, accounting for differences, like we said, in scope and sequence, and so local control is retained. We're going to have access, still have access to the learning continuum or a similar improved tool. So we might be able to even add more information to that learning continuum information and make that even more useful moving forward. And like we talked about a little bit, is it supports student mobility. So no matter where a student tests in the state, that history, those results are going to be able to follow that student from one school or from one district to another. And those are really great pieces about that. It's also going to retain the best of NSCAS Summative. So for instance, it's going to measure student performance relative to grade level expectations, criterion referenced information, and we're going to get some reporting in the fall, winter, and spring about how they're doing, how a student is doing in terms of that proficiency. We haven't determined what those reports will look like. We want to be very careful that we don't have unintended consequences for that, but we will get that information. Educators will help us figure out what those reports are going to look like. We're going to be able to continue to provide information based on Nebraska's achievement level descriptors, or ALDs. So Nebraska teachers wrote those ALDs, and we're going to continue to get information back based on those ALDs to continue to help us figure out where students are and where they need to go next in reaching our high expectations. We have the potential, like I said before, about the learning continuum to improve that tool by using Nebraska's ALDs to improve the information we're going to get back at the end of each one of those assessments. And like I said before, we're going to provide multiple chances for students to demonstrate proficiency or beyond. And so it's not just one opportunity at the end of the year. They're going to have multiple opportunities to shine to show us what they know and how they've grown throughout the year. And that will help us determine overall proficiency. The other thing that I'll mention is Nebraska educators have long had a strong voice in our assessment system. That's not going to change when we move to this adaptive through-year model. They're going to continue to have a strong voice in what we do. So how is it going to feel different? We have already talked about this a little bit, but there's going to be no need to administer 2 tests or to trade map growth for NSCAS Summative in the spring. So we'll only have to give 1 test. That 1 test will give us both the summative information we need and the map growth information that we want to use to influence and inform our educational decision making. Really, if you think about it, that spring test is really just going to be a 3rd interim test during the year, and then we'll be able to use all that data to determine proficiency. One of the things that you've probably been waiting for is some not great news, right? So how are we going to do all this and it's all going to be positive? Well, one of the things that we're going to have to give up a little bit is standardization. Right now, districts have a lot of control over map growth, about when they give it, the accommodations they use, the test window, the retake policies, security, all of these things. So one of the things that's going to have to happen is that we're going to have to standardize more of those practices around the map growth or the interim part of the assessment to be more standardized, to be more fair and consistent across districts. I might argue that that's a good thing, because then the results, when you compare results, are going to be more comparable and more accurate when you use those for comparison. But that is something that we're going to have to give up as individual districts to come more in line with one another on that. What I can tell you is that educators will be in the room helping us make those decisions and how we become more standardized. Adaptive through-year model. So a couple of different pieces. So one of the great pieces about this, typically when you change a test model, you break the trend line, right? You can't watch the trend go from year to year, and you have to break that trend line. Well, in this current model, we're going to maintain the table of specification, and so we're going to be able to maintain the trend line. And what do I mean by that is that currently we have a TOS, or table of specifications, out there for both ELA and math. When we determine proficiency, we're going to use those same table of specifications to determine proficiency. And so we're going to be able to continue to look at trends over time. We won't have to break that trend. So we'll be able to even look at this year, next year, the next year after that. How are we doing? How are we growing? How are we improving? So this model allows us to maintain that trend going forward. One of the other things that, and we've already talked about this quite a bit, maybe give you another example here. So when students take the fall and winter, they're going to have an option. Remember, those are optional, first of all. But if they do take them, they'll have multiple opportunities to show us and that they've learned something, or they demonstrate mastery over a specific indicator on the TOS. So if we look here at context clues, for instance, if a fourth grader gets fourth grade context clues questions in the fall and doesn't do very well, then again in the winter they might have another opportunity to show us that they know those fourth grade context clues questions. If they aren't able to show us again, then maybe they get another opportunity in the spring to show us that they've learned that. If a student is above that and maybe he's getting fifth grade or sixth grade context clues, we might check in again with them later on, but maybe they don't have to come back and show us again that they have those fourth grade context clues. And so overall, students will have multiple opportunities to show us they have it, but once they have it, they'll may be able to show us that they still have it and then move on, so that they're not spending as much time doing repetitive types of testing from administration to administration. Just if you look at this here, so right now we have two item banks. We have the MAP growth interim item bank, and we have the NSCAS general summative item bank. The NSCAS general summative item bank is made up of all items that were either written or reviewed by Nebraska educators. Everything in this basket over here was written by or approved by Nebraska educators. Everything that was written over here is aligned to Nebraska standards, but not everything is approved by Nebraska educators. Where we're going to get efficiencies and what we want to happen is being able to use items from either one of these for the other purpose. And so we're hoping that this middle space here continues to grow, that we can use NSCAS general summative information for MAP growth interim purposes, and we can use MAP growth items for NSCAS general purposes. The bigger this middle piece is, the more efficient the test will become. But what I'll tell you is that nothing from over here on this MAP growth side will be used for summative purposes unless Nebraska teachers approve that, right? And so any item that we move to being able to determine achievement levels and proficiency will have to be approved by teachers. And so that's an important aspect of that moving forward. Student experience. So students are their experience is gonna not be all that different from what the majority of our students do right now. One thing I'll say is that in the spring, 107,000 of our students are gonna have one fewer test to take. As far as that goes, they will only have to take an ELA test once. They won't have to take 2 math tests, right? So in many ways, this version looks very similar to what they've experienced. What I would say in general is that it's always incumbent on adults to create a positive atmosphere, right? So no matter what, adults have a big say in what happens in a testing situation. How much pressure students feel is often based on how much pressure the adult in the room is feeling or puts on students. And in general, what I would say is we need to work hard to reduce the amount of test anxiety, test pressure that students are feeling. We want to bring that down to a MAP growth level as opposed to pushing it up to a summative NSCAS level. And in general, if we can do a better job of focusing on growth, focusing on students just doing their best and not putting pressure on students, we'll have a better testing atmosphere overall. And we'll need your help doing that. And so we'll talk more about that as we go forward with this model. But I can't stress enough that board members, superintendents, administrative staff, teachers all have a role to play with creating a positive atmosphere around assessments, and we can do a better job of that overall. I know that there is a lot of pressure because of accountability, because of press, because of all of those things, but at some point we should be shouldering some of that and not letting it trickle down to the students that we're supposed to be serving. Students are going to still be able to see results and create goals. Hopefully they're going to be even more informed about the end of year expectations, and hopefully that will be a part of that positive atmosphere of improving, of growing, and focusing on that as opposed to just one proficiency level or achievement level at the end of the year. So once again, here are our goals. What we're trying to do with this NSCAS adaptive through year model. We're trying to focus on instruction, give multiple times for students to show us what they know, decrease overall testing times, and like I said, retain the best of what we have in NSCAS summative and MAP growth moving forward. It's important to note we've already started this work together. We've been doing things along the way here with NWA to set this up because we were always working on how do we further integrate our NSCAS assessment system. And so a lot of the work we've done is already paying off as we go down this road. What I'll tell you is we've been engaging Nebraska stakeholders. We're going to continue to engage those Nebraska stakeholders. We're going to continue to invite those advisory groups to give us information, to have input into the decision-making process. Not everything has been determined. We have lots of studies and a lot of things to learn as we go down this path. And so we want everybody to be involved and to give us feedback as we move forward. Here is that timeline again, a little more detailed and laid out for you. So once again, 18-19, we were using MAP growth and NSCAS general summative as I've described it. This current year, we have two major things going on. We still have MAP growth and NSCAS summative. Districts will still choose how they use MAP growth. But in this winter, we're going to have an NSCAS pilot. So one of the things a lot of people don't know is that the software engine that runs NSCAS is newer and updated compared to what MAP growth uses. So it's kind of the NSCAS engine 2.0, if you will. And so we're going to test with about 44 districts. We're going to test the MAP growth on using that newer NSCAS software engine. And so that's one of the pieces. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to be bringing in teachers this spring to kind of pop the hood and get under to study what MAP growth items look like. One thing we'd be doing this even if we weren't moving to this adaptive through-year model, but we need to better understand the rigor, the alignment of MAP growth items. So as we move forward with these two working together, we can understand where general summative, NSCAS general summative is, where MAP growth is, and as we combine them or make this hybrid model, how they're going to work together. In 20 and 21, we're going to continue to building. We're going to be doing lots of behind the scenes testing, running simulation, understanding, trying to better understand how each of those is working. We're still going to have MAP growth and NSCAS general, but we're going to be investigating, researching, doing all these studies behind the scenes in these next 2 years. And then in 21-22, we're going to implement the adaptive through-year model. One thing that I'll mention about this, right, is there's like a lot of things that we have to figure out still. So this is the current path we're on, but it's going to be continually informed by those studies and the information we have coming back in. So we might have to alter that path as we move forward. So we'll keep you up to date if that happens, right? If things change in our timelines, we'll let you know. We don't have all the details or the answers, but like I said before, I'll guarantee you that happens is Nebraska educators have a strong voice in making those decisions. We want you to ask questions and voice your concerns. If you have concerns about this, if you have questions about this, please let us know. This is the best time to ask those questions, because if you ask now, we can consider what the answer is and how we can move forward, right? We're going to try really hard to make this evolution into this adaptive through-year model as smooth and as transparent as we can as we continue to move forward. Additionally, we're going to work hard to identify any potential unintended consequences, and then try to really hard to mitigate those. So if we know what those unintended consequences are ahead of time, we can try to mitigate the negative effects of those on districts across the state. We have a list of things we're keeping in mind as we move forward, and we're working on addressing. So obviously this has implications for AQUEST accountability. We've been working with Lane Carr, the accountability director. He knows what's coming down the pipe here, and so he's been thoughtful, and we're going to continue to be thoughtful about the implications this has on AQUEST accountability. Implications for Nebraska Reading Act. We've heard loud and clear that this new model needs to be supportive of the Nebraska Reading Act, so we're working hard to make sure that happens. We're being thoughtful about how do students move in and out of this model. So if you're using, for instance, map growth in K2, how do they move into this 3 through 8 system? And then how do they move out into high school? And so we're being thoughtful about that. We're really working hard to make sure that students can move in and out of the system smoothly, and that we continue to give information back. For instance, ACT at the high school level, what information can we continue to give when students are in 8th grade about how students are likely to do when they're in the 3rd year cohort as a junior student. And so making sure that we're being thoughtful about how those pieces communicate with each other. We're also trying to identify current uses of map growth and trying to maintain as much of that as possible. So as people tell us, hey, we're using it for the map growth for this purpose or this purpose, we're going to work hard to make sure that we try to retain as many of those as possible. As you can imagine, trying to take 244 districts across the state and meet everybody where they are and make it work perfectly for everybody, that's a really tough thing to do, but we're going to work as hard as we can to make sure that we're retaining as much usage as possible for every district and how they're using the map growth currently. So what can districts do to prepare? So this information was provided from our Assessment and Accountability Advisory Committee. We asked them this question, and this is the answers they gave us. So they provide recommendations. So re-examine grade levels and frequencies that your students take map growth. So if you're only giving it at one grade level, you might think about, is that what we should continue to do as we move towards this new adaptive through-year model? You can examine if your district is maximizing the potential usefulness of map growth data. If you're maximizing that map growth data now, you're likely to continue to maximize that adaptive through-year data when we make the transition in 21-22. And also consider how map growth and NSCAS professional learning could fit into your PL plans, right? So as you're thinking about your professional learning plans, you might want to consult with your ESU or your district certified facilitators. How can we continue to build capacity in our teachers to use the data that we currently get from map growth and NSCAS, and then move into using that data with the adaptive through-year model? Okay, so next step. So we're recording this presentation as we speak. We're going to post this recording as well as a shorter version. There's about a 10-minute overview version that we're going to put out there for everyone. We have a frequently asked questions that's going to come out, as well as a one-page information. All of this information is going to be put on the website, and we're going to be able to share that with everybody from around the state. So this information is going to be put out there. We'll continue to put as much information out there to be transparent as possible with this adaptive through-year model as we can. If you have questions about the adaptive through-year model, about NSCAS innovation moving forward, please let us know at the assessment office. We're eager to take your questions, to think about the things that you're thinking about, to make sure that we have a smooth transition, that we're well informed. Please share this information with others moving forward, and we thank you for your time. If you tune back in, you will be able to see part 2 and part 3 of our regional assessment workshops. Thank you for your time, and take care.